what are the best settings for this monitor? And by best settings, I mean the settings which I use in my review because they meet my criteria for my colorimeter targets and also according to my own preferences, and they work on my unit. Of course, everyone's going to have their own preferences and individual units do differ. So the first thing I'm going to go through is the presets of the monitor. There are two different sets of presets on this monitor, as usual for MSI models. So there is gaming, which has game modes, and there's professional, which has pro modes. Now it's a bit confusing because you can see sRGB is selected at the moment, so you might think that that's the preset you've got active, but it actually isn't. It's whatever you selected last, whether that's in the gaming or the professional list. So in my case, it's actually got user selected. So if I wanted to select sRGB, I can do that. But then I have to remember that I don't have user selected. So it's a bit of an awkward way that they've laid the presets out, in my opinion. They could have made it clearer which one's actually active, but never mind, you do get used to it. So I'm just going to quickly go through the other game modes. What FPS does is it gives you a bright look, it over sharpens as well. It really lifts out detail in dark areas, so it's designed to give you a competitive edge. But there are various settings which you can enable yourself in user, which this just enables by default, so that's really what it does. Night vision, for example, is set to AI, which is a very strong setting. I will go through these very shortly. The racing mode, it looks more saturated, and again it has that strong over sharpening, and that's because image enhancement set to strongest. You can of course change that if you wish. There's RTS, more of the same really, and RPG, again, more of the same, just different settings by default really. User is much better balanced to give accurate output, a more appropriate output by default, but you can change things yourself. So professional, the pro modes. Eco, that reduces the brightness really. There's user, which is exactly the same as user in gaming. It doesn't matter whether you select it as a pro mode or a gaming preset, it's the same thing, and any changes you make to one will apply to the other. Anti-blue, which I explore a little bit in the review. It's a low blue light setting. Gives a bit of a green tint, but a warm tint. It is effective as a low blue light setting. Movie, which gives a very cool look to the image. Cool as in cool tinted and also over sharpens. Office, which is a bit better balanced, but does oversaturate. And sRGB. Now this may be a best setting for some people because it's an sRGB emulation setting. It clamps the gamut closer to sRGB, rather than the native gamut of the monitor used for the other settings, which extends a lot beyond sRGB. And just be aware that you can adjust brightness with sRGB, but you can't adjust contrast, you can't adjust the color temperature, and there are no gamma settings on this monitor to concern yourself with. So my preference, if you're not wanting to use sRGB, really is to use user. I used user in the review, and that's because I always like to use the full native gamut of the monitor to explore its full potential in that respect, and I explore sRGB separately where appropriate. So sticking to the gaming menu, be aware that if you're using a professional setting, any of these which are unlocked, you can change. So for example, if I switch over to sRGB, go back to gaming, then I can change things like the response time. And likewise, if I have a game mode active, so I've switched to user, you can change things in the professional menu. So low blue light is applied as a filter over the preset you're using. This is an effective low blue light setting, and I explore that in the review. So in this menu, gaming, I made sure the response time is set to fast. That's my preference, all explored in the review. Some people may prefer fastest, and particularly if you're running at a static refresh rate where the acceleration levels are a bit lower for each of these settings, then fastest may well work for you. They're explored in detail in the review, so do refer to that. If you want to use VRR, then you have to have adaptive sync set to on. I didn't specifically change anything in professional. In image, I set the brightness to 45. That got my usual target close to 160 nits as I go for consistency in my reviews, and it suits my lighting environment, but your lighting environment is going to be individual to you and your own preferences, so please do set this appropriately for yourself. And color temperature, I set to customization, which allows me to change the red, green, and blue color channels. I set red to 44, green to 50, blue to 45. Be aware that individual units will vary, so these are just a suggestion. They're not necessarily going to be optimal in all cases. A little quirk about this menu, something I don't particularly like. It's not a big deal, just that if I want to go back, I have to cycle down through all of these settings. So I either press the joystick in or press down, and then I can go back. So it's a little bit annoying if I just wanted to quickly change, for example, the red channel, then I might want to go back straight away. No, I have to cycle through all of these first. Just a little nitpick of mine. And that's all I changed actually. I went over to the user setting, reduced the brightness and tweaked the color channels, and also made sure the response time was set to fast. I believe that's the default anyway. I can't quite remember though. So I said I was going to go through the night vision setting. So I will briefly do that. I don't consider this a best setting per se, but it is something which some people will want to use for a competitive edge. So as I export in the review, the gamma of this monitor is such that there's an elevation of dark detail anyway. You can't see this properly in the video, but to my eyes, I can see all of these squares rather clearly, including the very top row, the very first square. Shouldn't really be like that if it's tracking the 2.2 gamma curve correctly. But if you want to really boost things up further, you can use night vision, so set to normal, it boosts things up a bit. Strong, further, strongest, further again. And AI gives an even stronger boost than the obviously inappropriately named strongest. I believe AI is actually supposed to be looking at the image and will make changes according to the image itself. So it doesn't necessarily always give you a super strong boost, it just depends on what's being displayed. But it also affects the black depth. All of these settings, even normal, affects the black depth, so you lose contrast. I prefer more selective settings than this personally. It does do its main job of giving a competitive edge. AI vision, which you can enable, and that is like setting night vision to AI. You can see it's grayed out now, the night vision setting though, so it's like setting it to AI, which was the strongest setting available really. It also has a dynamic contrast element, so it changes the backlight according to the overall level of light and dark on the image. And because of the dynamic contrast element, that is why it says enabling it will affect, basically disable, brightness control, MPRT, HDCR, which is the dynamic contrast setting, and night vision. I'm just going to enable HDR in Windows and switch my attention over to HDR now. Shadow of the Tomb Raider running the game in HDR, just to show you this with something which is a little bit more interesting to look at than the desktop, but this is going to be super quick anyway because there's really very little you can change under HDR. And as I explore in the review, HDR on this monitor is not really very good, so as a best setting I would actually recommend just avoiding HDR on this monitor, quite frankly. But if you do want to use it, it looks like you can change the preset, but actually all this is doing for you is it's changing the sharpness to various different levels. It's adjusting a sharpness filter. It's the same with professional. It looks like there are various different options here. It's just that some of them apply a sharpness filter. Actually, most of these do absolutely nothing. And you can manually adjust the sharpness filter if you wish. So there's weak, medium, strong, and strongest. Quite self-explanatory as to what they do. There's also a sharpness control in image. So that's a different type of sharpness filter. So you can adjust sharpness if you want, but I just generally recommend sticking to user or another preset that uses a neutral sharpness under HDR. You can change the response time if you wish, but it's very similar to under SDR. In general, I'd recommend fast. And that's really all you can adjust.